D-Day. The 24 hours that saved the world. The tide was wrong. The moon was wrong. The weather was catastrophic. And yet, on June 6, 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower scribbled a single word on a slip of paper that would determine the fate of civilization. Okay, let's go. What happened in the next 24 hours was not inevitable. It was not guaranteed. And it very nearly didn't happen at all. The gamble that almost wasn't. Picture this. The largest invasion force in human history. 156,000 men, 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, sitting idle in English ports while storms battered the channel. Eisenhower had already postponed once. His meteorologist, a 29-year-old Scotsman named James Stagg, had just presented him with the slimmest of openings. A brief window of marginally acceptable weather on June 6th. After that, the tides wouldn't be right again for weeks. But here's what most people don't know. If Eisenhower waited, the secret would leak. Over 1 million troops couldn't simply remain coiled in southern England indefinitely. German intelligence would figure it out. The element of surprise, the invasion's most precious asset, would evaporate like morning mist over the bocage. At 4:15 a.m. on June 5th, in a mansion called Southwick House, Eisenhower polled his commanders. The decision was his alone, but he wanted their counsel. Admiral Bertram Ramsay said go. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, haunted by visions of transports burning over France, urged caution. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, never one for hesitation, simply said, I would say go. Eisenhower stood, hands in pockets, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had already written the failure message in his head, the one that began, Our landings have failed. He had even drafted it on paper, taking personal responsibility for the disaster he feared might unfold. Okay, let's go, he said. And with those 3 words, he set in motion the most audacious military operation ever conceived. The deception that fooled a Führer. While Eisenhower wrestled with weather reports, another drama was unfolding, one that would prove just as crucial as the landings themselves. Operation Fortitude, the most elaborate deception in military history, had convinced Hitler and his high command that the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. The Allies had created an entire phantom army, the first U.S. Army group supposedly commanded by George S. Patton, complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and even fictional social events reported in newspapers. German reconnaissance planes photographed the dummy installations. Their intelligence officers cataloged the phantom divisions, and they believed every word of it. On the night of June 5th, while 822 aircraft towed gliders toward Normandy and thousands of paratroopers checked their chutes one final time, Hitler slept. His standing orders forbade anyone from waking him except for the actual invasion. And when reports of parachute drops began filtering in after midnight, his commanders assumed it was a feint. The real attack, they assured themselves, would come at Calais. This conviction would paralyze German reinforcements for crucial hours, in some cases for days. The 15th Army, Germany's strongest force in France, sat idle 150 miles away, while the beaches of Normandy turned red with blood. Hitler himself didn't wake until nearly noon on June 6th. By then, 156,000 Allied soldiers were ashore. The longest night. But let's rewind to those paratroopers, because their story is where D-Day truly begins. At 10:30 p.m. on June 5th, American paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions began boarding their C-47 transport planes. Many were teenagers who had never seen combat. Some vomited from air sickness or fear. Others sang songs or played cards with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. At 12:15 a.m. on June 6th, 15 minutes after midnight, the first Pathfinders jumped into darkness over the Cotentin Peninsula. Their job was to mark drop zones for the main force. Instead, they scattered across miles of French countryside, many landing in the flooded marshes Rommel had created as obstacles. Men drowned in 3 feet of water, weighed down by 100 pounds of equipment. The main drops between 1 and 2 a.m. were chaos. Pilots flying through anti-aircraft fire and clouds dispersed their sticks of paratroopers across an area of hundreds of square miles. Companies that should have assembled as units instead coalesced into tiny bands of lost soldiers collecting stragglers in the darkness. The 82nd Airborne's commander, Matthew Ridgway, had predicted 50% casualties. As dawn broke, it looked like he might have been optimistic. And yet, and this is the stunning part, the chaos worked. German commanders, receiving reports of paratroopers everywhere, became convinced they faced a massive airborne assault across Normandy. They couldn't distinguish between the planned drops and the accidental ones. They saw a cunning strategy where there was only confusion. Divisions that might have counterattacked the beaches instead chased phantoms through the hedgerows. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment landed on the church steeple in Sainte-Mère-Église. His parachute caught on the spire. He hung there for 2 hours, playing dead, while firefights raged in the streets below. He survived. The town was liberated by dawn. And when you visit Sainte-Mère-Église today, you'll see a dummy paratrooper still hanging from that steeple, a monument to the longest night in history. The Bloody Shore. At 6:30 a.m., naval guns fell silent, and the first waves hit the beaches. At Utah Beach, strong currents pushed the landing craft a mile south of their intended target. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., 56 years old, armed with a walking stick, and the only general in the first wave, took one look around and made an instant decision. We'll start the war from here. It was the right call. Utah Beach, accidentally landed on the weakest sector of German defenses, would suffer only 197 casualties. Omaha Beach was a different story. The pre-invasion bombing had missed. Naval bombardment had been too brief. The German 342nd Infantry Division, a combat-hardened unit whose presence the Allies hadn't detected, held the high ground. As landing craft ramps dropped, machine gun fire raked the boats. Men fell in the water, drowned by their equipment. Bodies washed ashore with the tide. Companies took 90% casualties in the first minutes. By 8:30 a.m., the invasion at Omaha Beach had stalled. Rangers clung to the base of cliffs. Engineers couldn't clear obstacles because the beaches were too crowded with the dead and dying. Landing craft crews, seeing the carnage, hesitated to approach shore. A junior naval officer watching through binoculars wrote in his log, "This operation is a failure." But here's what he couldn't see. On that beach, in that moment, small groups of men were making impossible decisions. A colonel named George Taylor rallied soldiers with words that would echo through history. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Destroyers, defying orders, drove so close to shore they scraped bottom, firing point blank at German bunkers. By noon, men were cresting the bluffs. By nightfall, 34,000 troops were ashore at Omaha, though nearly 5,000 were casualties. The beaches were secured, but barely. If the Germans had counterattacked in force that afternoon, they might have driven the Allies back into the sea. They didn't, because they were still waiting for the real invasion at Calais. The day democracy held its breath. While men died on Norman beaches, the world held its breath. In London, King George VI knelt in prayer. In Washington, President Roosevelt did the same, leading the nation in a radio prayer he had written himself. In Moscow, Stalin, informed of the invasion by Allied intelligence, waited to see if his Western allies would finally deliver on their promise of a second front. And in Germany, as reports filtered up through the chain of command, Hitler remained convinced that Normandy was a diversion. He refused to release the panzer divisions that might have crushed the beachhead. By the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. By midnight on June 6th, 156,000 Allied troops were ashore across 5 beaches. They had suffered approximately 10,000 casualties, 4,114 confirmed dead. It was a butcher's bill that would be considered catastrophic in any other context. But in the context of what they had achieved and what they had prevented, it was, somehow, a victory. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impregnable fortress, had been breached. The road to Berlin was open. The tide of the war had turned. Why it matters today. 80 years later, we live in the world those 156,000 men, and the thousands who died, created. Without D-Day, Western Europe might have fallen entirely under Soviet domination. The Holocaust would have continued unchecked for months or years longer. Democracy itself might have lost its grip on the Western world.